that's a good question. So, in Bethesda, if you build, and Gwen, you can correct me if I get this wrong, but if you build any type of for-sale housing or rental housing, you have to dedicate a certain share of that as affordable to people who make lower incomes, by law. In Fairfax, if you're building in Tyson's Corner, for example, you as a developer agree to provide a certain share of income of housing if you're building a condominium, affordable to people at a whole tier of income ranges in exchange for being able to build a higher building. It depends. If you're in DC, you are required to set aside a certain percentage of new condominiums affordable to people at certain lower incomes as well. But here in the Washington area, where you are makes a difference in the answer to that question. Yeah, that's a good question. The question was about the mortgage interest deduction, which we don't think of as a public subsidy from the federal government. It is exactly public assistance for housing. We just don't think about it like that. But every time somebody claims the mortgage interest tax deduction, it is revenue that the federal government doesn't collect, right? And so by that measure, it's an expense. More than 75% of the spending the federal government does on housing is for the mortgage interest tax deduction. And more than 75% of people claiming the mortgage interest tax deduction make over $150,000. And so the largest federal program for housing benefits people who make the most money. The limits on the price of the home you can get the deduction on is pretty high. I don't know what exactly. And there's a proposal to cap that at $500,000, which is actually a big deal for our region. But you'd still get it. You would just get it up to the value of $500,000. And then shift those resources into Section 8 housing choice voucher programs, which are rental assistance, to sort of redistribute how the federal government spends its housing assistance. And I think the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a national group that's working very hard on that issue if you're interested in learning how to become involved at the federal level in that. But I think that's such a great point because we never do that. When we show like local spending on housing, we show CDBG and public housing. It's like, we never have a line that's like, how many residents benefit from the mortgage interest tax deduction? And what's the value of that deduction in our community? In fact, I think we tried to do that for Arlington when we were going, and it's hard to calculate, but yep, so the question is about the growth in the professional and business services sector, and a substantial portion of the growth since the recession has been in companies that do not do business with the federal government. Yeah, but not as much as we need, right? There is still this, we just got data that tried to look at how our industries that don't tie to the federal government, how they're doing. They're not doing very well as we thought. There's a project out there called the Roadmap for Economic Prosperity, something like that, in the Washington, D.C. area that Stephen Fuller at George Mason and the 2030 group are working on. And they just looked at those non-government sectors over the last couple of years, not as well as we should be in order to make sure that we're in a good place.
So thank you all. I'm Gwen Wright. I'm the planning director in Montgomery County. And I'm here to talk today about housing in Montgomery County in general, but to really focus in specifically on work we've been doing recently with Lisa and with another consulting group about rental housing in Montgomery County, because we've been working for about the last 2 years on a major rental housing study and have a lot of interesting ideas coming out from that. So the good news is that Montgomery County's population is still growing. We are growing at a much slower pace than perhaps we did historically, but we are still growing about 1% per year. But 1% of 1 million people is a lot, and so we expect to have, by 2040, another 200,000 people living in Montgomery County. At the same time, we have been looking at where those people are going to live in the county. So we did an analysis of what our constraints are and what land is constrained either by environmental issues or by man-made issues, and what land is left unconstrained for new development. And so from an environmental standpoint, we have, as you all probably know, a very significant agricultural reserve, 93,000 acres of land in the north and west part of the county is set aside for agriculture and rural open space and really isn't available for significant development. We have Stream Valley Parks and a very active park system. And we have a lot of, on the man-made side, a lot of really stable single-family neighborhoods that we see as important and beneficial to the county, and we don't want to see encroachment into those neighborhoods. So if you look at all of those different kinds of constraints, both natural and man-made, we only have maybe 19% of the land in the county left unconstrained and available for new development. So we're a maturing county. We don't have the kinds of large green fields for redevelopment that we may have had in the past. And the areas that are unconstrained are what you see in white on that map. So it's a little bit like Swiss cheese. There are just little pieces of pockets of land here and there throughout the county that are available. And what's important to note is that all of those little pockets of unconstrained land are near other people's houses. And they are, areas where the impact of new development, of infill new development is going to be perceived, and the issue of compatibility is going to be a significant issue. As Lisa had said, and she stole some of my thunder, but this is specifically about Montgomery County, we have a decreasing rate of new housing. We have a 20-year average of about 3,400 units per year, and our 10-year average since the recession has been like 2,500 units per year. Based on our growth projections, the 200,000 people, we need 4,200 units per year. So even if we had kept our 20-year average, we would be below what we need to provide enough housing. And so it goes back to that supply and demand issue, that if you have too little supply and enough demand, the prices of housing are just going to continue to rise. And they have been. And what we've been seeing is that our households who are what is considered cost burdened, that is spending 35% on their housing costs, and as you heard from Lisa, 30% is optimal. We have in the blue line, it is owners, and that 20% of our owners are spending more than 35%, and 39% of our renters are spending more than 35% and are cost burdened. We also have some interesting demographic trends going on in the county that we need to take into account and that are perhaps driving the types of new housing that we are seeing. Because again, the other factor in all of this, although we, the government like to think that through our land use policies and our zoning, we can direct things and control things, the market really controls things. And we have several trends that we see really affecting our new housing projects that are being proposed. One is that we have a lot of seniors. We're an aging population. The number of adults older than 70 will increase by 91% over the next 2 decades. And of baby boomers, 37%, they're very or somewhat likely to move within 5 years from the single-family house that they may have been living in into some other kind of facility. Many seniors live alone, have at least one type of disability, and have limited resources. The demand, so all that means the demand for affordable, supportive, accessible housing is going to increase exponentially in the future, and we are seeing that. On the other end, millennials, they were 32% of all home buyers last year, but many of them are renting. 66% of millennials are renters, and of those, 32% live in multifamily housing. They have lower home ownership rates and slower transitions into marriage and child rearing, and they're going to have a large impact on our rental demand. They also have high student loan debts and weak income growth, and that's going to constrain their ability to afford housing, whether it be rental or ultimately ownership. Montgomery County has always been very progressive in terms of its housing policies, but we hadn't changed things in quite a few years and felt like it was time to take a look and sort of refresh our programs. We found some very, very interesting data. These are just a couple of highlights that our market is unbalanced at the highest and lowest ends, meaning we have 21,000 unit shortage for folks earning less than 30% of the area median income, but we also have a 13,000 unit shortage for households earning more than 120% of the area median income. And what that means is we actually had a pretty good supply of housing for folks affordable at 60 to 80% area median income, but we're getting downward pressure on that housing from folks who could afford more but are choosing to get a good deal and pay less, and we're getting upward pressure from folks who are probably doubling up and folks who make less doubling up and also looking for those units that are in the 60 to 80% area median income. 80% of the renters with incomes less than 30% are cost burdened. So we talked about how there are already many people cost burdened, but for folks with the incomes less than 30%, it's 80% of them that are cost burdened. We also have a relatively older stock of housing. 55% of our rental units in Montgomery County were built prior to 1980, and only 14% were constructed since the year 2000. I know some of this is surprising information, especially for people in Montgomery County, because they see a lot of construction going on. They see a lot of new multifamily buildings going up. Everyone thinks, number one, we have too much housing, and as you saw from the earlier chart, that's not the case. But we also have not produced an enormous amount of rental housing, even since 2000. So just a quick project overview of this rental housing study. Data collection was the first step, enormous effort to really look in detail at all of our data on rental housing, looking at a detailed analysis of best practices in other places, financial feasibility, and sort of cost benefit. And now we're in the third phase of the recommendations about identifying the options, putting them in a final report. We have an advisory committee that has broad representation, getting their ideas and passing these ideas by that committee, and then presenting the final report to our elected and appointed officials. So I'm going to just go through a few more key findings, and I'm going to try to go through some of this relatively quickly because there's a lot here, and I don't want to get bogged down on any one particular issue. But rental housing accounts for 30% of all the units in the county. There certainly are a lot along metro lines and the new kinds of high-rise multifamily, but 40%, and folks don't necessarily think about this when they think about rental housing, are 3-bedroom or more units, and many of them are townhouse conversions, people who owned townhouses and then decided to rent their townhouses out. Those are included in our rental housing supply information, and a large percentage, 40%, are perhaps older townhouses, larger units that have been converted to rental. Our rental population is very diverse. 66% of our renters are over 35 years old, which again was a surprising piece of information. More than 50% of our renters earn less than 100% of area median income, and households that are below 50% of area median income are 38% of our demand. So again, really important data. Households that have the lowest income are the least served. I think we've talked about that. Affordability is greatest in smaller units. Only 12% of those larger units are affordable to people below 80% area median income. Approximately 50% of all renter households are cost burden. It's much greater for the lower incomes, as we've talked about. And again, we have this, we're sort of unbalanced in terms of supply and demand at the lowest end and at the upper ends. One of the things that we had to think about a lot as we embarked upon thinking, you know, what are we going to do about all of these issues that were coming out from the data was, you know, sort of what are our policies, what are our priorities, what is our bottom line in terms of what we want in housing in the county. And we had several defining principles. One is that we definitely want to promote policies. We are committed to doing something about housing in the county, that we believe in scattered site opportunities and income diversity. That has been a hallmark of all of our housing policies. But flexibility combined with predictability is essential. We have to think about ways as we are reaching out and dealing with new issues with infill housing. We have to think about new ways to be flexible. Many people in the county have said, well, you have older market rate affordable units, just don't do anything. Don't upzone them, don't change them in any way, and then they'll stay affordable, even if they're near transit and in neighborhoods that are changing and becoming very attractive. And what we've said to that is, well, that isn't doable because you keep forgetting about that other factor, the market. If a neighborhood is attractive, even existing market rate affordable that doesn't have any rent control or any other kind of government program associated with it will simply be renovated and the rents will be raised and they will stop being market rate affordable. And so doing nothing isn't a solution to preserving market rate affordable housing. But there may be ways that production of new housing can be tied to preservation of existing market rate affordable in a way that may help. And again, we are talking about trying to produce a vibrant yet stable and sustainable housing marketplace. So we ended up having recommendations in 4 categories. One is changes to our existing MPDU, which stands for Moderately Priced Dwelling Unit Program. That's our inclusionary zoning program, and I'll describe it a little more in a minute. Using some land use and zoning tools, some preservation tools for our existing market rate affordable, and financial tools. And I'm going to, again, just go through these relatively quickly. Our MPDU program, we're thinking about changes to increase our requirements, do it on a FAR, and that's floor area ratio based approach rather than a per unit based approach, and I'll describe that. A sliding scale and having an off-site option. Very briefly, you all may have heard of inclusionary zoning. And that is when a jurisdiction says, if you build in our jurisdiction, certain numbers of units have to be for moderately priced residents. And we've had a program since 1974 in Montgomery County. It requires 12.5% of new units, whether they're rental or ownership, to be affordable at 60 to 70% area median income. And that's if you build over 20 units. It could be over 20 townhouses, or it could be over 20 multifamily units, or 20 single family homes. But you have to provide 12.5% moderately priced dwelling units. And right now, You have to provide those for 99 years if it's rental and 30 years if it's for sale. We increased those times in 2004. Over the years, 15,000 MPDUs have been produced, 10,000 for sale, and 5,000 rental. But we are looking at ways to improve the program. It's a great program, it's been very effective, but we are looking at ways to try to improve it. We're looking at increasing the requirement from 12.5 to 15%. There's a challenge because some folks feel that that could chill our development market, but so far in very desirable areas down county, it seems that folks are accepting that. This second one is complicated, and I'll try to explain it as simplistically as I can. Today, the 12.5% is based on the number of units. So if you have 100 units in a new multifamily building, 13 of them have to be moderately priced dwelling units. But if that new building is all efficiencies in one bedrooms, then the 13 units are all efficiencies and one bedrooms. What we've found is that really and truly what we need are units that have 2 and 3 bedrooms. So what we've said is perhaps instead of having it calculated per unit, it would be calculated on square footage. So if you had a 100,000 square foot building and you were doing 15% MPDUs, you would say 15,000 square feet of that building needs to be affordable units under the MPDU program. And we can work with the property owner to decide if that's going to be, you know, that 15,000 square feet, if it's going to be 15 1,000 square foot units or 30 500 square foot units. However, we feel the need is in that particular area and what the demand is. So we're looking at that change to, again, be more flexible. Right now, the MPDU program only focuses on 60 to 70% area median income. We've said maybe in a particular project we would want half the units to be for folks who make 30 to 50% area median income, and then the other half could be slightly higher, folks who make 80% area median income, let's say. And so to provide that kind of flexibility. And then we've looked at if there are options for off-site MPDUs. One of the issues with for sale condominiums that hasn't been talked about is when you're doing a multifamily building that is a condominium, you can have MPDUs, but the problem comes in the folks who buy it at a lower rate still have to pay the condo fees. And the condo fees at times can be higher than the mortgage that they would end up paying, and it becomes a huge problem. So there has been some discussion, particularly with ownership, with condo MPDUs, is should you try to do something that is off-site rather than create a difficult situation in a new condo building. Anyway, we are, again, looking at the increase requirement, doing the FAR system, a sliding scale, and off-site, but we would keep it within the same planning area. On land use and zoning, and again, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because I'm not going to take time away from my colleagues, hopefully. We want to look more at the adaptive reuse of existing buildings. One of the things we're finding in Montgomery County is that we have actually some suburban office parks that are not as popular as they used to be and have high vacancy rates, and we're looking at can you convert buildings into affordable housing. And we're also looking at reduced parking requirements, which lowers the cost of building new housing because parking is a very expensive part. And particularly near transit, it really helps foster a transit culture if there are fewer parking spaces. We're looking at modified bonus density. We have in most of our mixed-use areas an optional method zoning tool, and we're looking at how we can perhaps give more bonus density with affordable housing issues, particularly preservation of affordable housing, and we're looking at opportunities to co-locate affordable housing on public lands. In terms of preservation tools, and again, this was one we wrestled with long and hard, we want to, again, inventory our at-risk properties. We do have in Montgomery County, our Department of Housing and Community Affairs has a right of first refusal program, and so there's an opportunity if we have at-risk properties to perhaps look at acquisition, and that's tied in with that second expanded right of first refusal. We also are looking at new incentives for combining partial redevelopment and partial preservation. And we've seen some effective examples of that in Arlington and other places where, especially if you have a whole garden apartment complex, you keep some of the garden apartments and then you develop perhaps on the parking lot or on a different part of that complex, a more dense high-rise building, and you're able to keep some of the garden apartments as affordable. And financial education, really working with renters in the county to make sure that they are very aware of their rights and that they understand the finances of housing. Financial tools that we're looking at, obviously general appropriations, as they say, more money, more money, more money. That's really where it's at. We need to get more funding. We're looking at a possibility of doing an in lieu fee for small projects, although that's always very controversial, but we're looking at whether it makes sense for a project that might give us only 2 or 3 affordable units. Could that money be better to have that money in place, and could it be more effective to produce more units in a different way? Local housing vouchers, and that is to increase access to housing amongst our lowest income households. Demolition fees, which was also an interesting idea on the preservation side of essentially making demolition a less attractive option. Some tax increment financing, that might be a possibility if we're looking at a large area that is redeveloping and transitioning. And taking a lesson from Northern Virginia. There's the 9% low-income housing tax credit, which is, again, something that was mentioned in Lisa's presentation that helps fill that gap. In Maryland, we're always competing against Baltimore, and Baltimore has a lot of needs, and so we usually don't do very well in the low-income housing tax credit competition. But what they've done in Northern Virginia, which had that same problem, is they actually got the state to set aside a specific Northern Virginia pool. And we're looking at, can we get Maryland to set aside a specific Washington region or Washington area pool for probably Montgomery and Prince George's counties so that we aren't competing with Baltimore or some of the other areas in the state.